Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to the video from Friday the 22nd of March 2024. And today I wanted to do a little bit of a debrief on yesterday's Bank of England meeting, and also wanted to discuss some of the stats that have been released yesterday and today, and also just a little roundup of March so far really, so we can dive a bit deeper into that Bank of England meeting. So yesterday I released a video on the channel that predicted that the vote would be 6 votes to hold. It was very, very obvious that the bank were going to hold the rate yesterday for anyone who pays a reasonable amount of attention to what the bank says, what the people on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee say. It was probably one of the easiest meetings there's been for a long time, knowing that they were going to hold the rate. There was no two ways about it. I'd said in recent months that we'd have to have that meeting where nobody voted upwards before anyone would even consider a cut. And don't forget how slow central bankers like to be. Now, I released a video that said there was going to be 6 that were going to vote to hold, 1 that was going to vote to cut. So I got those 7 predictions right, those people, but I said 2 would still vote to raise the rate, and neither of them voted to raise the rate. And the actual result was 8 to hold and 1 to cut. So that means we should be expecting a cut sooner rather than later. However, lots of people excitedly think maybe it's the next meeting or the meeting after. I'm not so sure about that. If you track back the vote over the recent sort of 6-month period, we had a September meeting where it was very, very close to raise the rate to 5.5. We instead voted 5 to 4 against raising the rate. So 5 holders and 4 raisers. And those raisers have dropped back into line, and it's taken 6 months. The last 2 have only dropped back into line over the past 7 weeks, moving from raise to hold. So the third one only dropped back the meeting before in December, 2023, to move her vote to hold from still raising. And the fourth one voted to hold at the meeting after the September meeting. So that just shows you 6 months, 4 committee meetings, just quite how long it's taken for those to change their position. Now, in that time, CPI inflation has moved from near enough 7 point something percent down to 3.4. So it's halved in that time. Although CPI isn't the only story, we've got to remember that the components of CPI have come down a reasonable amount in that time period, especially energy. Energy and therefore food also there's been some month-on-month drops in those prices, particularly energy. But of course, there was such a big rise in energy prices. Energy prices, particularly gas, rose more than anything. But remember, we generate 40% of our electricity in the UK by burning gas still. So that gas rise of like 1,000% over a relatively short space of time was incredibly damaging to the energy side, which is what really blew that inflation piece up. Although there was already that supply chain disruption that was working in the background anyway, at a huge cost to the government, and therefore a huge cost to the people, a huge cost to society. But that's what it is to not be an energy independent nation. The US did not suffer from that massive spike, yet still they're struggling to control their CPI inflation. So CPI nicely down, but remember, I keep talking about the services component of CPI, 47% of CPI, still at 6.1% after the release earlier this week. Not really being talked about, but half of the rate is basically 3% thanks to the services side. That's been, chopping around. That's the lowest print since December 2022 on the services inflation. That's positive, but it's still 6.1%. And when we see the massive wage rises we've got to put up with over the course of this year, 5-6% on average and minimum 10+%, then ultimately I don't see how that services inflation figure is coming down at any particular speed, any real amount, because people are going to keep pushing those prices. Companies are going to keep pushing those prices until they can't sell those services anymore. It really is as simple as that. And you can look at all sorts of businesses, but if you think about the price in pubs, the price in fish and chip shops now, you'll know that it's increased 66% or so, and they're going to be slow in putting their prices down again. And they can be slow in putting their prices down again. It's quite legitimate, because if you've signed an energy contract for 1 or 2 years over the past 6 months or so, let's say, it's going to take some time for that new energy price to filter through and be lower. And of course, it's predicated on there not being any further geopolitical disruptions that upset our energy prices yet again. I heard the other day that the equivalent of what happened in the gas price market was the equivalent of oil going to over $1,000 a barrel. So can you imagine what that would have done to prices at the petrol pumps and the likes? But anyway, I digress. So that's where the services inflation side is. And also the wage rises. We are still looking at north of 6% excluding bonus for wage rises over the past 12 months. Yes, that's looking backwards over the past 12 months, but so does the inflation figure ultimately. And bits that haven't been really said this week: 0.6 month on month, 0.6 month on month for core inflation. Core inflation is still at 4.5%. Look, it's all good news that it's coming down, but we have to think about two things: the trend, which is good at the moment, and then the absolute number. And then we've got to dig behind the trend to see what we think might be going on. So, for example, these energy price cuts are not going to keep happening. They're going to run out of steam when we get to July's energy price cap, which is currently forecast and soon will be enshrined, probably around May time, for another fall in energy prices, right? We had a 15% cut that's enshrined for April in the price cap. That's great news for households, puts more money in their pocket, could fuel consumption. Some of that money will go towards consumption. And of course, day by day, consumption is still getting squeezed because lots of people, 100,000 plus people a month, maybe 150,000 a month, are still dropping off cheaper mortgage rates and having to refix at higher mortgage rates. So don't forget that drag effect in the background on the household consumption is still happening. And that's part of the argument of the one economist on the committee who votes downwards. But anyway, that's the backstory. We're also seeing to drop out of the figures these particularly high rises, these 10% plus rises, the last one of which drops out in April. So we are still expecting inflation to trend downwards over the next couple of months. There's no two ways about it. How much? We'll find out, right? But we'll have to wait and see a little bit. But some people have been saying it'll be under 2% by April. I'm struggling to see that myself, but you don't know. There have been some big drops in the figures, and there are anomalies in the figures when you don't necessarily realise when that month drops out and this month drops in, a bit like February 23 versus February 24, there's a huge differential in the prices because that's where the energy prices peaked, or that's where the petrol prices peaked, or something like that. Don't forget just how tight it was only 12 months ago, realistically. So we've had the bank committee get to 8-1 on the vote. We had the consumer confidence figures this morning. The print was -21. I shared the tragic news about a month ago that we haven't had a positive consumer confidence print since January 2016. That's really how bad it is, but that's a deterioration on last month's figures. Things had looked up a little bit. Cautious optimism was the word that I used. We're back down into the -20 sort of range. It's really not ideal, but we are where we are. And retail sales this morning, absolutely flatlining. Perhaps not a big surprise. And that's where we are. So just a very quick roundup of March so far. We had, obviously, we're normally looking backwards in terms of the data that we've had. Nationwide are always out first with their house price index. They were at 0.7, 1.2 for the year. Halifax weren't too far behind. They were at 0.4 for February and at 1.7 for the year. We've had the global manufacturing PMI come in at 47.5 for the UK. Still below 50, not ideal. Retail sales struggling along. Services PMI doing really well, which suggests that services can keep along dealing with this services inflation, putting their prices up, dealing with the wage rise cost implications they've got to deal with. We had unemployment last week, 3.9, still below 4%, no real massive cause for concern. And as I said, 6.1 on the wage increases, which is significant. We had the GDP, economy returning to growth. The Bank of England will have taken that into account, of course. Although, as I said at the time, it's been particularly volatile. And 0.2, whilst not to be sniffed at month on month, and it's not small, we're talking billions of pounds, they're ultimately in growth. The 3 month is still -0.1, and the 1 year was still negative as well, -0.3 over the course of a whole year. So a very, very flat environment still. And they'll be conscious of that. And that's one of the reasons why they want to drop the rates as soon as they can to try and take that choke point out of the system. With the RICS house price balance still -10, but one of the best prints we've had since October, the best print since October 2022. So that's significant. CPI, as I said earlier, 3.4. Good news, trending in the right direction. But I remain far from convinced that the inflationary issues we're facing have been solved.